This talk has, I think, changed and morphed since the program. It was 2, it's now 1. There were 2 presenters, there's now 4. So I'm not even going to introduce anybody. But I think Siyavula, Siyavula is a project that deals with South African education system, and as a person who kind of grew up through changes in the way that South African education worked, I know full well the pains that have been going through that process, and I think they'll talk about how some of the OER resources that they're using and creating can really help reduce some of that pain. So I'll let them take it away and tell you what they're doing.
Hi. Is it on? It doesn't. Oh, okay. My name's Mark Horner. I work at the Shuttleworth Foundation in South Africa, and I'm the project manager for the Siyavula project. Andre didn't shirk his duties. We told him not to try to introduce us. We're just changing everything around. But with me, I've got Kathi Fletcher from the Connexions team, Cynthia from ISKME, and Thierstein from Connexions. And it'll become evident why they're up here in a second. The objective of the Siyavula project is to make sure that South African teachers have access to a full set of curriculum-aligned materials that covers all subjects, all grades, that they're free and available in an open manner for them to use, adapt, distribute, print, whatever they need to do. And furthermore, to make sure that that body of material is sustainable. Right. So in South Africa, we relatively recently rolled out a completely new curriculum, a radical departure from the old curriculum, and we rolled it out in a very short time frame. So a large number of teachers didn't receive training, the materials don't exist to support the new curriculum, etc. It's an outcomes-based education curriculum, and what it ultimately does call for is for individual teachers to develop a lot of material on their own. That's part of the curriculum, so they're required to develop material. Now, I have a simple view of the education system, which I'm just going to put up quickly, and then talk to you about how Siyavula is going to impact this. The curriculum is obviously thought up by the Department of Education, and South Africa has provinces, a bit like states, and they take guidance from the national standard, but the details of how everything gets implemented are up to them. They cannot change the standard. There's one national standard. And then it goes down to districts, and within the districts there exist curriculum advisors, who are the people ultimately charged with ensuring that teachers deliver the curriculum in the classroom. There's obviously a lot more hierarchy to it, but that's essentially what happens. When you look at the spectrum of teachers, the vast majority of teachers feel under-resourced, under-supported, and very isolated. So I call those my isolated teachers. But when we talk to teachers in South Africa, we find that a few small communities are formed to try to deal with the new curriculum, where they come together in what I'm just going to call swap and share groups. It tells you exactly what they do. A group of teachers come together, they bring resources, they share them, they discuss the challenges in the classroom, they support each other. And this helps them get through the amount of content that they need to produce and deal with things that they don't understand in the new curriculum. So it makes a lot of sense. The key thing to note about these groups in South Africa is that these groups always form, or at least all the ones we've found, and we've looked pretty hard, from teachers at well-resourced schools who don't, at least naively I would say, don't need a support structure. They've got plenty of textbooks, they've got the money to print the resources they need, they've got internet access, they've got computers. They're the teachers least in need of support, yet they value it. So the point that I'd like to make here is that the teachers inherently value sharing and value having community. Okay? That's not, that wasn't the plan. Oh! Okay, it's a Mac. I want to go back one. There we go. So I described what Siyavula is trying to achieve. We're going to put open learning materials online. So we would need a repository, it needs to be accessible, we need the tools for that. We need to take the curriculum structures from government. We need to make it aligned so that teachers are happy to use the resources, they know what they're getting, etc. So we need to import the curriculum framework, we need to have roles for experts. But our sustainability relies on communities of practice. Siyavula is not going to be a project which exists for a long time that seeks out funding to continue supporting teachers and developing material. That's not what we want to do, which is why we've got all these, one of the reasons we've got all these partners that we try to work with. We don't want to be redeveloping platforms and things like that. We want to actually bring people together so that a sustainable use of tools that already exist and content that already exists happens. So on the ground, we'd like to help develop more of these swap and share type groups, real communities of practice, not just forced sharing circles. So we need some support for initial community development, some community tools, and we want to expand those sharing circles. So if we can do all of that, that picture of the curriculum system changes somewhat. We can import the structures from the Department of Education into whatever solution Siyavula actually has at the end of the day. There needs to be the ability for these swap and share groups to do what they do more efficiently using whatever tools we provide. They also need to be able to edit those resources. We need to allow the curriculum advisors to vet it. This is where we start to see the amplifying power of the technology. One good curriculum advisor could vet resources which the rest of the country can see, rather than the current situation where it's localized to their district. And the isolated teachers at first would get access to those resources, which would at least start to support them in the meantime. Ultimately, we'd like to bring them around and form lots and lots of different sharing circles so that all teachers have some support structure. Okay. We decided to try to acquire educational resources because initially we thought we could provide the tools and we'd be able to develop these sharing circles slowly over time. But then an opportunity to acquire a significant amount of material presented itself. So what I've got as part of this project already is a comprehensive set of resources which covers grades 1, well, what we call kindergarten the reception year. So it covers R through 9. So 10 years of content for all subjects in 2 languages. Okay, so we've got more than 75% of grades covered, which means we've got resources to support well over 75% of learners at the moment. It's text-based material ready for print. The final accessibility requirement in South African schools is hard copy on a desk at this point. All right, it is curriculum aligned. Okay, and I say it's community enabled because there are 1,000 schools that were using it as a commercial product before we bought it out. Okay, so we had to choose a platform, and there were 4 key things that we used to decide which platform to use. We needed to be able to import this vast body of material that we've got, and we wanted to be able to then allow teachers to edit it, mix it, adapt it, etc., as well as import their own materials. This was very important. We needed vetting structures for curriculum advisors and experts, and we needed to be able to typeset stuff properly so that we could print it. So ultimately no platform met all of our criteria up front. We felt that we'd have to do some work on any of them, but the platform that was most closely aligned was Connexions, which is why Kathi and Joel are up here. And so we didn't want to build our own platform and try to maintain it and spend millions building it from scratch and then have to deal with the long-term sustainability. We wanted to find a project that has a good track record, that looks like it's going to be around for a long time, that's doing things right, and doing these 4 things. These were our 4 key features that we needed. And then we're going to import all of our material into that. Okay. Once we've done that, what we actually wanted to do, let me go, is bring these isolated teachers around into forming these swap and share type groups. So what we're actually doing on the ground now is creating a community development intervention where we support teachers through a process that has both technical training on the website as well as training around group dynamics, etc. We're not going to force people into groups. It's a completely voluntary process, despite how rigid this diagram looks, where teachers opt into a process and they can opt out at any time, and they opt into sessions. We support them. When they call for training, facilitators will go to their meetings and train them on whatever aspects they want to be trained on, so that they form their own self-organizing principles, which means that they're more likely to be a sustainable group once we stop providing support. So that's very important. Putting people through a rigid training program, curriculum of technical skills, doesn't make people want to talk to each other, doesn't help them deal with conflict, doesn't help them support each other at all. But so we're creating a process where they form communities of practice, which takes a very long time, but at least creating an enabling environment in which those communities can start to form was our goal. And so what we're doing is next weekend we start off with our first 100 teachers, bringing teachers who've opted to come to a weekend training session, to come and learn about the website, learn about groups, and see if any groups emerge in that. It's all completely voluntary. So ultimately we'd like to spit out communities of practice, which are things you can't actually force, which makes this quite a challenge, especially from a project management perspective. So you've got to check boxes on budgets. So that's where we are. Next weekend we'll start with our training, and we've been uploading content into Connexions. We've also spent a lot of time trying to make sure that Connexions meets some of the other requirements that we have for the South African curriculum standards and things like that, so that we can better form communities. They need to have discussions, they need to know about curriculum alignment, etc. And so I think Kathi will talk about that in a second. I just want to say we think we've closed the loop. We have a printing solution that we're going to roll out as well, but it's an entirely different project that'll link to this. But now that teachers can get resources, use them in the classroom, have discussions around them, support each other, and feed all of those learnings back into the repository, which exposes all of those learnings to the curriculum experts who write the curriculum advisors can see what's really happening in the classrooms, the teachers can see what other teachers are doing, have discussions around it, and those resources are available for the isolated teachers. So we think that we can have that iterative loop that we require for quality OERs in the system now once we've deployed it. And so to make it sustainable, we went with Connexions. To make sure that our learnings are available, we've partnered with ISKME out of California to make sure that the global OER community knows about our learnings and that, but they partner with people on the ground so that all of the issues around local context are taken into account. All of the training that I mentioned here is done by another team. We don't employ any of these people. We've partnered with people to develop a training program which they can sell to other funders or the Department of Education. They're already a provider who do support for computer labs in schools. So then I'll hand over to Kathi to talk about the software development that we've been doing.
Hi, so I'm Kathi Fletcher. I'm the project manager at Connexions. And I'm not going to talk a lot about technology because really what's exciting about this project is that it started from the communities of practice that the Siyavula team is modeling, those swap and shares that are already existing groups of teachers that are sharing material. And so the interesting thing about this project, to us, we're a platform provider, we're technologists, we can sit in a room and invent all kinds of things, and whether that'll actually be useful is a whole nother question. So here, instead of, coming out of our heads, the actual development that occurred on the platform came from trying to model communities that already exist. And so Mark's team looked at what's missing to support these communities in the way they already work. Here's Connexions. We have a lot of that built, but there are pieces that are missing. And so this both gave us an experience of really starting from a real project that is going to be used by teachers. That's going to inform the development. And then the other cool thing is that we didn't do this development. Their team did the development. So that kind of is the fruition of the open source software that Connexions is built on. So it's very interesting. So the pieces that I'm just going to very briefly show you that were added by Mark's technology team is that it added ratings to content. So here are these teachers. They need to be able to actually express the effects of using this material, if it's good, if it's not good. Forums on both our lenses, and lenses in Connexions are views into this open repository. Views that any community can set up and that allow them to say, hey, here's content that we find useful or we've endorsed or we've reviewed. There are lots of different ways that people are using lenses. But as a part of that process, the Siyavula team needed to capture the discussions that were going on in these swap and shares. So how do you do that when you're trying to take them to an online virtual community? And the other piece that they added was the ability to create a lens that's not just free-form tags added to content, but actually a curriculum that is, a top-down delivery of the alignment, but then an open process for actually getting that alignment onto content. And that's the last piece, and I'm not going to show you the open lenses, but one of the things that they were really looking at, this whole idea of sustainability. Well, they've done an alignment of all the content initially, but is that the perfect alignment? It may not be. When teachers get into their classroom and they're really using it, they may find that a great resource for another topic on the South African curriculum hasn't been aligned that way, and it really ought to be so that their fellow teachers can use it in that same way. So that pushed us to say, how do you make the lenses a way for people from the outside to actually communicate to an already existing community? So teachers can do alignment, and then it's reviewed before it gets published. Okay, so just the first really small thing is, you know, we've always had content's freely available and you can get to it from anywhere, but how do you get feedback, really quick feedback? We've done the email the author, and really interesting relationships developed through that, but what if you just want to come to the site and give a quick rating, you know, in the same way that Amazon and various other things do. So these guys added the ratings. Forums, so this is a lens. This is a set of content that's picked by a community. It's out of the global repository. The community also can tag the content and comment on it. And then, how do they discuss, is this the right set of stuff that we really want to use together? That's through the forums, also added by the Siyavula team. And this is just another picture of a discussion going on around that. And you can see the South African terminology, and this is all created by their need for alignment with their foundation phase science. You know, that kind of reflects something that Connexions started with a long time ago, that we're not going to be the right people to figure out all the subject terminology, all the alignment for all this content. It's an open repository, so it's going to have to be the communities that create this. And we've got to provide the tools that allow them to attach this specialized discipline-based information to the content. And then finally, the other piece that they added was Connexions has had, you know, tags that anybody can add to content after the content is published, and the Siyavula team added a curriculum-based, vocabulary-based way to do lensing. So the lens maker creates the vocabulary, and then content that's added, you're choosing what assessment standards does this content go with. And of course, for a single piece of content, it can be in multiple lenses. So it can be mapped to many different curriculum and other, you know, other types of tagging frameworks. So that's really, you know, those are the pieces that I wanted to just briefly highlight, and mainly it's about the process. That these were not tools that we developed as technologists sitting in our ivory tower. This is really coming out of a community process. And then the next piece that is just incredibly exciting for us is that they're now going into the next few months using this on the ground. And Cynthia is going to be talking about some pre-evaluation that they did earlier in the year, and her team will be continuing to evaluate that. And so you really have closing the loop there. We'll get that information back. These features, you know, are modeled on an existing community practice, but they're still not going to be perfect. In order to get, you know, this software to work well, we're going to use that feedback, and that's really quite exciting. So I will now give it to Cynthia to show you what they did initially and talk about the research aspect of this.
Okay. So again, I'm Cynthia Jimes, and I'm from the Institute for the Study of Knowledge Management and Education, and we're the research partner on the Siyavula project. And our role is basically to inform along the way the implementation of the Siyavula model by adding knowledge that we collect directly from the teachers and the users that this project will actually impact. And as the first part of that research, we visited South Africa in March, and we really wanted to get an understanding of the context and collect data directly from teachers and document what we saw. And so all of the pictures that I have here in the presentation were taken during that site visit in March. So this is a classroom that we visited that had a smartboard, which is not representative, of course, of all schools. But what our primary research questions were in the early phases of this were to really understand what the teacher's curriculum development needs are, and to understand, based upon the practices that they already have in place around curriculum development and the challenges that they're facing, how can that inform and help us to understand what opportunities and challenges exist for the implementation of the Siyavula model. So what we did in March was we visited a few schools. We talked to school administrators, district administrators. We talked to teachers. We observed the pilot workshops that were done with teachers at SciFest, which I think you mentioned SciFest, didn't you? And we conducted a baseline teacher survey, and we collected data from about 200 teachers from a mix of urban and rural schools. So just an overview of the findings. We saw that there was a definite need for a model like Siyavula's. Teachers expressed in the survey, and the teachers that we spoke to as well, were really enthusiastic about Siyavula. They said that they were facing a lot of curriculum challenges, including getting access to materials they need and knowing how to align the materials that they already had with the new curriculum standards. We found that, however, there were, of course, cultural and technological and other challenges in place, or barriers that might need to be considered in order to successfully implement the project. And I'll go over those in a little bit. But also, we found, most importantly, that teachers, they already have these offline behaviors, as both Mark and Kathi referred to, that are sort of, you can classify them as OER behaviors. They're already remixing and reusing and meeting with other teachers to discuss curriculum informally. So just a little bit from our survey, the context. It was a mix of urban and rural schools that I mentioned. Not all schools had textbooks for all their learners. I think 64% of them had running water. 20% didn't have desks for all learners. So it was a mix, and there were under-resourced and resourced schools that teachers that participated in the survey. 37% had a computer lab, and 32% had the internet at their schools. And when we observed the workshops with the teachers, a lot of them expressed concern over the fact that they didn't have access to a computer, either in their school or outside of school. So, you know, they wondered, how can we take advantage of this great opportunity? But as I mentioned in the overview, there is definitely an evidence for a need for Siyavula, or a model like Siyavula. Because they express concrete challenges that they were facing, and the primary one was not having the curriculum materials they needed. And then also, as I mentioned, there were evidence of OER behaviors already occurring. So 74% of the teachers we surveyed are discussing materials informally with their colleagues, and 72% are sharing materials they have with other teachers. They're also providing feedback on other people's content and receiving feedback, although that's occurring to a lesser degree. And interestingly, they're modifying and editing and combining materials more than they are just using them as is. So that was a really interesting findings. We observed one of the swap and share groups that Mark mentioned, and it was a great process. It was about 8 teachers, and they come in with printouts of exercises or exams that they had used in their own classes, and they line them up on a table, and then they go sit at another table, and they discuss some of the frustrations they have in understanding how they can best support or align their content to curriculum standards. And they shared ideas on new ways to teach new concepts. So it was a really interesting process to observe. Let's see. What were some of the barriers? So this is a great project. Teachers were enthusiastic about it. They're already practicing behaviors that can be potentially kind of migrated online. But what were some of the barriers that we found? Well, the most obvious one was the one I mentioned, that not everybody has access to a computer or internet. When we did our survey, we asked them if they knew about specific tools, online tools, and 20% of them said they didn't know what email was. They haven't necessarily had the professional development that they need to understand how to take advantage of some of the tools, technology tools. We also found through interviews and observations with teachers and with administrators that teachers might face some resistance in their schools in terms of kind of becoming this curriculum expert and taking control of their content, because there's structures in place that might be a little averse to that. Also, we found that some teachers might not see the value of technology. So this picture is of a computer lab that was at one of the schools we visited. And when we went in and observed a teacher there who had her students sitting at the computers, and one of the first things she said was, well, I'm a home ec teacher. My principal requires me to come in here and work with my students, but I don't really understand why I need to do this. So that might be one of the barriers. Whoops. So what does this all mean for Siyavula if we take a step back from the research that we did? It obviously means that there's potential for leveraging some of these offline communities that already exist, these collaborative swap and share groups. Further supporting teachers who are doing these reuse, remix, sharing, collaborative content creation. And then also importantly, supporting workarounds for teachers without access to the internet. There was, in one of the workshops, we discussed potentially having one teacher who did have access to the internet, getting materials and printing them out. She could potentially be, or he could potentially be part of a group with teachers who didn't have access. So you kind of have maybe a point person who does get the materials online and then can share them with those that don't. And then also, the implications suggest integrating discussions of cultural barriers that might exist in teachers' schools, and also basic technology skills like email and so forth. Integrating that into the professional development workshops that Siyavula is conducting with teachers. So going forward, the research, so this was kind of the baseline data collection that we did. And going forward, we'll be looking at the community building intervention that Siyavula is doing with the teachers, and understanding, following these groups along the way that are forming communities, and understanding the impact of these new online OER behaviors in their classrooms. So, and Joel wanted to wrap up for us.
Thank you. Briefly, I'll leave some time for some questions. At the beginning of the conference, I did a talk on best practices, which was, hopefully the point of that was that things are evolving and changing, and we're starting to settle on some ways of doing things that are better than others. That's normal. As a new market sector develops, best practices are developed in the market sector, and that because they work better than others. One of the things that happens when new market sectors are developed is that everybody wants to do everything themselves, because there's really nothing out there that can help me do my thing my way. And that's very normal, and it's probably true also. As the market sector develops, then you start to have segmentation where people start to specialize in different aspects of the market sector. Aresh Bissel's in the back and representing Creative Commons, who is part of this team, even though he's not up at the front with us. The work that his group has done over the years has helped to advance the intellectual property standards in the discipline of open education. And so we're starting to see that segmentation in the marketplace where everybody's not doing their own thing. This is an example of that, where everybody's not doing their own thing anymore, and you have market segmentation, which has historically been a way that market segments have started to settle down, and things have started to become commonplace in society. And so I see this partnership, and the way my summation is that this is the way of the future of OER. We're starting to become a really viable part of society now, and it's exciting to be a part of that. We want some time for questions, and we'll open it up to the floor now for questions. And do we need to run the microphone around first?
I just kind of have a question around language barriers in South Africa, just with the whole, I think 12 official languages at the moment, 11, although the sign language thing, I think, yeah. But what is kind of the requirements around the resources? And I mean, surely within those curriculums there's certainly lessons in all of the languages, and certainly in instruction in those languages. How how is that being represented?
So the government would like to provide mother tongue education, grades 1 to 6, and then you split into a primary instruction in either English or Afrikaans. So English or Afrikaans is where we've got all the resources that we have. We've got grades 1 to 9, well, R to 9 covered, and then 10, 11, and 12 maths and science covered at this point. It's the problem, well, so it's a big problem, 11 official languages for grades 1 to 6, and the publishers aren't able to produce all of those books, and no publisher is prepared to take the hit of trying to do all of that, so those resources just don't exist as it is. So OERs presents an opportunity to work with people to do translation and things like that. We've got the content that we purchased, we've had translated into Xhosa in grades 4, 5, and 6 for 4 of the subjects, so it's a starting point, but I mean, you know, so there's still 8 more to go, and then there's all the other grades and subjects. So the problem is just huge. So I don't really have a solution, but I definitely think we're on a better track for eventually addressing that with open educational resources that can be translated as people need them, than trying to kind of mandate or convince a publisher to do it. Or the government has to just pay for it to be developed, and they're not doing that at this point. I don't know, so, but it is a problem.
My question is for you, Mark, or maybe Cynthia. If we had more content out on mobile devices that use the packet switching network, would that be better or easier to get to than the internet?
Yeah, so I mean, we have better than 80% mobile penetration in South Africa and at school level. So I mean, we have better penetration for mobile networks than running water, electricity, or healthcare. Well, healthcare goes for most countries, I guess. So yeah, absolutely. But because of the ConnexML format, we can easily convert modules that are on Connexions into a mobile-friendly XHTML format and deliver them. And we've been talking about that. So we want to partner with people out of the Maraka Institute, which is an institute in South Africa that has a mobile learning research unit, and they're looking at what could we do? How could we best suck content out? And with the lenses, it's good because we know the curriculum aligned content. We've got the curriculum standards in now. Now all we do have to do is transform it so that it's kind of mobile friendly. So we absolutely need to do that.
Can I add something to that? So also the group, when we asked the teachers in the survey how they were communicating with other teachers to share ideas about curriculum, they of course 93% face-to-face, but also and they could select multiple answers on this question, but SMS was the second most frequent way that they communicated around content, which was interesting. Yeah. Or text messaging. Yeah.
It seems like eventually maybe you could replace some of the horrendous cost of printing.
Yeah, no. So we think we can at least drive the. So we can drive the cost of printing down, at least as an intermediate measure, because without editors, authors, and publishers' royalties, if we print sort of 10,000 plus units of an open textbook, the price is an order of magnitude cheaper than what the publishers are selling books for. So it now becomes cheaper to replace the book every single year with an updated version than to buy a publisher's book every 5 years for a school. But so there's a few we can leverage mobile technology. We've just got in new undersea cable, so bandwidth in South Africa should improve. The government's just run out an initiative to try to get every single teacher in the country a laptop with internet access. So all of those programs are out there. None of them, have hit the ground yet. But if we've got content, we can ride those waves in, I think, and have a really big impact. But the mobile stuff definitely, especially doing mobile assessments and things like that, really help learners.
What is the interest of the Shuttleworth Foundation, and how does it fit in with other things that are kind of associated with what Mark Shuttleworth is up to?
Do you have a particular thing that he's up to in mind? Well, Ubuntu is open source software. So the objective of the Shuttleworth Foundation is to create an open knowledge society, and we try to address all issues around that. So everything from the technical and legal aspects. So we worry about IP and copyright law, telecommunications infrastructure, and the monopolies that exist in South Africa on that, all the way through to access to educational resources, the skills you need to participate in an open knowledge society, and then 21st century learning skills. How do you process new media? You need to have new media literacy skills. You need to be able to deliver educational content on mobile devices. So I mean, we have a telecommunications fellow, an IP and copyright law fellow. We have a guy working on 21st century learning, and then Philip Schmidt, the peer-to-peer university advocate, is also a fellow at the Shuttleworth Foundation. So we're looking at an open knowledge society. That's what we're trying to drive in South Africa, and we try to work in a coherent way to achieve that. All aspects from infrastructure through to legal and basic skills.
Is it open the society in South Africa, or is it global?
No, so I mean, we'd like to work globally. Obviously, we're a very small foundation. So I mean, in the US, you have much larger foundations. So we work within South Africa, but we try to partner as much as possible with international organizations to make sure that we try to practice open philanthropy as well. So anything we get right or wrong, we try to make all of those learnings publicly available so that other people can learn from our mistakes. And so we'd like to help change things internationally, but it's just a case of trying to run projects and partner as much as possible and see how we can affect change. But we are based in Cape Town, so it's obviously more practical to do on-the-ground projects near home. Arash.
So I'm excited to see this sort of phraseology and OER-ready behaviors, or whatever you called it, Cynthia, because that's certainly been an impression of mine about one of the more obvious drivers for the movement. Is it seems to reinforce things that we know people already do, even if they didn't have the language for it. And it's a point of pushback I get from a lot of people that, teachers just don't do that. They just take what we have and they just swallow it, right, and then spit it back out. And so I would love to see more research like that, and I'm wondering if you're engaged in more research like that, or if you have ideas of other projects where you can get similar kinds of information that could then inform what we're doing.
So ISKME, we conduct workshops with teachers also to facilitate community building around OER, and as always, as part of those workshops, we do about 2 a month, I think now. We do a similar survey where we're trying to understand what are their existing behaviors, and over time we'll collect enough data to do a real analysis of that, and it'll be so great to compare it to the Siyavula data and see, are those behaviors occurring more here or there, or, yeah.
Yeah, the whole situation of the politics around language policy, I worked on it in South Africa, and just in the immediate post-apartheid area. And of course, one of the whole traditional, historical aspects was that the non-English speaking world denied access to English, and this was one of the ways of keeping them down and denying them higher education, denying them political voice. And so the language policy, which I was on that committee, when it came out, it's a triumph in some ways, a disaster in other ways. It's extremely complex, as you all very well know better than I do. So I'm just wondering if this is allowing greater access to these large organizations which were promoting access to English. And so I'm wondering if this provides a way for providing greater access to English. And in fact, many of the groups who were traditionally schooled in their home languages are now gravitating towards some of this so that they can in fact go on to higher education, because without English they can't. I know it's a very politically loaded question.
Yeah, so I've got a few thoughts. So firstly, you can go into higher education in English and Afrikaans in South Africa. No. And part of that is that those languages didn't develop over time, so they don't have the technical vocabularies to do, nuclear physics or medicine. I think it will ultimately be English. That'll be the language that's chosen at the end of the day, because it doesn't have the apartheid legacy associated with it. It's not the language of the oppressor. So, many of the riots back in the 80s were because of Afrikaans language instruction. But it's going to take a lot of time. So the thing is that we've been putting resources on Connexions now for months, but they're not linked to all of our lenses yet. That'll happen in the next couple of weeks. But what we actually find is that our resources seem to be most useful to Afrikaans teachers in South Africa because there's no other Afrikaans content online. So they're the biggest consumers of what we've got at this point. So I can't tell you if it's giving African learners or indigenous language speakers better access to educational resources at this time. I certainly think we can drive down the cost, and so many of those schools are previously disadvantaged. They cannot afford textbooks. So if we just put English textbooks in those schools, I mean, we've kind of met that objective. Yeah, so I mean, I agree completely. One of the problems is that no group, you come out of apartheid era and you absolutely don't want to marginalize anybody, which is why we have 11 official languages. So I mean, but there needs to be a bit of a mature approach to how we're going to deal with education and make sure we can participate in a global society. And Afrikaans doesn't meet those objectives either. It's a language which has the vocabulary to have advanced topics taught in it, but it's also not an international language. We've only got one international language in South Africa, and that is English. So it's just a matter. I mean, it's just a matter of time. So I think. You still have a question? Sure.
I was really intrigued by the effort that you put to the research effort to get a better understanding of how to move forward with the project, and I'm just wondering, is your survey shareable, and is that something that, I mean, I could see it being relevant in my own context, really. Yeah, and perhaps your methodology, that sort of thing. Okay.
I just had a kind of a comment on the Afrikaans resources that you're putting up. Simply because so many millions of people were forced to learn it and to speak it, it's really valuable to have them up there, just because that's the only kind of well understood language in South Africa that a lot of people can speak. So those resources aren't in English yet, but they are resources that people can use, and they weren't available before. So having even Afrikaans resources, even with its stigma, still helps.
So the point was that under apartheid, everybody was forced to learn Afrikaans. So it has baggage, but it is the most widely spoken, to some extent, language in the country.
So I'm just thinking about in the U.S. that K-12 is just starting to get into the OER conversation, and I'm wondering if Siyavula or Connexions has thought about what kind of connections might be made between this project and K-12 ed in the United States and Canada and other countries. We have enough problems in the U.S. trying to crosswalk our state standards with each other, but really that's not too difficult. It's just a mapping question. I'm looking for advantages, connections that might exist in the future, and to help us, particularly in the U.S., to bring public K-12 along in this conversation, see this as an example, and also look for opportunities to share content back and forth.
Sure. Yes, is the answer. We've looked at the content. We've had experts look at the content from the U.S. and see how applicable the content is. And the answer we got back generally, we haven't done specific drill downs yet in any of the fields, but the answer generally was about 50% is usable as is. The other 50% is less usable, and it's a sliding scale after that, to not usable at all to fairly close, just slightly modifiable. So we're working with a few foundations to hopefully push that forward. So hopefully that will be coming in the future.
Sure. So, I mean, one of the points of doing the software development and adding it to Connexions is none of the tools are restricted at the moment, but so for beta testing. But hopefully the curriculum tools, the technical tools which are useful in South Africa, will be useful in the US as well. So that'll translate well, at least infrastructure-wise.
Definitely the alignment tools. We have a lot of interest. A lot of other people want to use that. And, of those resources, it may take a while to get kind of a formal mapping of the resources to the K-12 curriculum here, but they are, individual teachers find things on their own just by, searching our stuff or searching Google. And so some of those items with their, will be useful right away, even though, the kind of slower mapping, careful thing will take a little while to put all together. But there's a lot of interest in it.
I think so I'm just thinking of, like, in the future, a new tool in Connections might be, I come into Connections, who are you? I'm an 8th grade teacher, I teach math, I'm in Utah. And it says, okay, we know what your state standards are, and here's how it links to curriculum in South Africa. That's the tool that we're going to use.
Yeah, so that's a little way off, but we've already seen some remixing of content that we've got that came through the Siyavula project. The Free High School Science text content's been remixed into some of the other books. And that's before it's easy to find. There's almost no discoverability, and it was taken from PDF files. So, once it's all incorporated properly in standards, in ConnexML, which allows us to mix it properly, that'll just get much easier. So people are already jumping over the barriers to reuse stuff. So we're just going to suppress all of those barriers. It should really take off, I hope.
I think it would be quite interesting to see how people are using exactly the service and what they learn and what kind of learning takes place, both in the teacher's point of view or side, but also in the actual students, the learners, the end learners. And if I was wondering if there is any provision to trace that, to go back, and how would that feed back to the redesign of some of the tools in Connections or Siyavula directly. And a second part of the question, if it would be interesting to see if this changes any pedagogical styles that are embedded in the sort of more participatory learning.
Those are great questions. So we do have plans to watch how they're editing the content, what they're doing with the content that they find on Connections, what they're doing in their work groups with these teachers that they form very organically. And then in the next phase of our research, it will be very important to look at how these new behaviors, or these behaviors that are now online, are potentially changing their pedagogical practices, changing, maybe students in their classrooms are collaborating more, maybe teachers are collaborating with their students. So that is a very important part of the research, is to actually look at those things. Yeah.
From a tools side, I really think that's the next frontier, is to really connect assessment with the open materials. It is one of the things that's very powerful about open materials, is the ability to connect those. And we have interest, at Connections in doing that, but we would also like to make sure our framework is incredibly open so that other tools that are doing assessment can connect information about the content and how it's used, and the assessments and how they're used, and which content seems to do well, as far as people advancing in their learning objectives. So I think that's really quite interesting, and it's important to gather the data about how it's working informally and locally, and then capture that and do that in an automated way.
Right, I think that's time. Thank you guys very much. That was fantastic.